Welcome back to Project Montero. If you're just now joining us on this video series, we've been overhauling the cooling system on a 99 Montero Sport Limited. So far, we've changed the coolant temperature sensor, the thermostat, and done a coolant flush. And in the last episode, we changed out an old leaking radiator just to find out that we had a leaking water pump as well. So on this episode, we'll be swapping out the water pump as well as the timing belt. While I was preparing for this repair, I asked around to a lot of other Montero enthusiasts to see if they had any tips or tricks for me, and the overall takeaway that I had was that I needed to get the Aisin brand kit that they sell on rockauto.com, so that's what I'm unboxing here. This kit comes with the timing belt, the two pulleys that you'll need for that, the auto tensioner, the water pump, and the gasket for the water pump. And I've also added front cam seals for both sides and a crankshaft seal as well. I know we just installed this new radiator on the last episode, but we're going to need to pull it right back out for this job, which leads me to my next point. Since this was my first time doing this job, obviously there were a lot of things I wish I would have done differently, and I'm going to try and point those out as I go. The first one being, I didn't think that I needed to remove the radiator. I thought I could do it without, but you'll definitely need to if you have the stock crankshaft bolt. But once you have your radiator out, you can start removing all of the accessory belts from the front by first loosening the bolt on the tensioner pulley, and then loosening the bolt connected to the tensioner pulley to loosen the belt. There are 5 10mm nuts that are holding the cooling fan on, so once you break those loose, the fan will come off. It can be difficult if these are really stuck on to break them loose without the pulley spinning, so if you stick a screwdriver between two of the studs, you can hold the pulley in place while you break those nuts loose. And if I were doing this again, I would probably pull the fan off before I did any of the accessory belts so that it was easier to get to them. But once the fan is off, you can start removing the rest of the belts. This is the one on the driver's side for the AC condenser. So same thing, the bolt that goes through the tensioner pulley, loosen that up. And then the tensioner pulley bolt, if you loosen that as well, then it will provide enough slack into your belt to get it off. And then the last belt to come off is the alternator belt. Again, loosening the tensioner pulley. The only difference with this one is that the tensioner bolt is facing down, so it's better to access from the bottom side. Loosen that and the belt will come off. And before we mess with the alternator anymore, we are just going to go ahead and disconnect the battery. Back over here, the alternator is held on by two 14mm bolts. There's one on the top and one on the bottom. When I was doing this, I thought that I could just undo the top one and slide the alternator out of the way, but you'll see later I find that it is attached to the accessory panel on the top and the bottom, so you can remove the entire alternator at this point. So I've talked about several things that I should have removed that I didn't. Now we can talk about things that I did remove but didn't need to. I went ahead and removed each one of the tensioner pulleys from the accessory plate, but I didn't need to do that. I found that I was able to access all of the accessory plate bolts without removing the tensioners. So you'll see them removed here, but just know that you don't have to do that yourself. And a quick tip, when you're doing this job, you're going to have tons of bolts. A lot of them are going to have the same head size, but a lot of them are going to be different lengths. So whenever I pull a part off and the bolts come with it, I like to just put the bolts back in those holes before I set it aside, so I know where they go when I put it back on. And now you can see me realizing that I should have removed the alternator all along. So just remove that bottom 14mm bolt as well, and the alternator should just fall out. And it gave me a good opportunity to inspect this one and realize that that passenger side valve cover was leaking like crazy, and this thing is just completely coated in oil. And what I didn't show is that there is a plug here and a ground here that you'll need to remove as well. Okay, now on the top side of the engine, we need to unbolt the oil filler neck. It's just 3 12mm bolts. And you can undo those hose clamps right below the cap and remove this completely, but I just set it off to the side and that seemed to work just fine. This pulley that connects to the power steering pump also needs to come off. There are a few 12mm bolts on the bottom side. And then to get to the bolts that are on the back side, you will need to twist the pulley so that the holes line up with the bolts, and then you can unbolt those as well. And now you can sit back and enjoy the struggle of me trying to figure out which bolts are still holding this thing on. And come to find out, it was just these two 10mm that are connected to the shroud that goes around the pulley. Now, there was one bolt that I missed here that you'll need to remove this plate, but I'll come back to it in a second. Right now, I'm just undoing all of the 14mm bolts that are holding the accessory plate on. And with all the pulleys gone now, you should have enough room to get in there with an impact. And now I'm going back and finding that one bolt that I forgot. And once this panel is gone, the entire accessory plate should slide right off. And after that panel is off, we can start removing the timing covers. And this is just a series of 10mm bolts. And I didn't even realize this was here until I removed it, but you do have this access panel that you can take off at any time, even with the entire engine assembled, to check the status of your timing belt to see if there are any cracks or if the timing is in check. Now it is time to go after that infamous crankshaft bolt. We have a 22mm socket that we're going to throw on the impact. Oh wait, we can't do that because I didn't pull my radiator out. So if you didn't listen to what I said earlier, listen to me now and pull the radiator out. And as you'll see here, the reason why you can't just put a breaker bar on it is because as soon as you start trying to loosen it, you're just going to rotate the whole engine over. So here is my moment of shame, removing the radiator. And I know those of you that have done this job are probably laughing at me trying to get this bolt off with a 12-volt DeWalt, but you know, I figured I would try, and I tried and tried and tried, and unfortunately it didn't work. So, plan B. After I tried plan A just one more time. So plan B is pretty sketchy, but very effective. So I soaked it down with some WD-40, let that penetrate for a while, and I put the breaker bar back on, rotated the engine slightly until it was braced up against the frame. you can see the setup that I have here. And then once you have it nice and braced up against the frame, just start cranking the engine over, and it's going to stop because that breaker bar is holding it in place. But I cranked and cranked and cranked, and sure enough, that bolt finally broke loose. And before you move on, just give yourself a quick high five because you did a hard thing. But once that bolt is out, there is a third piece to the timing cover, and that just sits right behind that harmonic balancer there. So a few more 12mm bolts, and that should come right off. And when I say that should come right off, that's assuming that your harmonic balancer is not hermetically sealed to your crankshaft. So if you happen to run into this issue as well, I just started very carefully tapping that harmonic balancer and inching it off. It was connected to the crankshaft sprocket there, so as I pulled the harmonic balancer off, so came that sprocket, but it needed to come off anyway, so I just separated the two once they were off the vehicle. But hopefully your harmonic balancer slid right off, and then the lower timing cover should have come off right after that. And then you would unbolt the tensioner pulley and the auto tensioner here to remove your timing belt. And from what I've been told, this auto tensioner is the most important part that you would need to get OEM for this job. I know a lot of other places have other kits. I found one locally here, a Duralast one from AutoZone, and I was tempted to get that. But the more I talked to my friends online, the more I realized that I do need to go OEM on this one. And I don't have footage of me removing it, but there is a small bracket right here that holds this black crankshaft position sensor wire in place. So just remove that with 2 bolts. And then we'll start working on getting the coolant housing removed so that we can get down to the water pump. And again, if this footage looks pretty scattered, like I have no idea what I'm doing, it's because I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I'm just trying to figure out which bolts need to come out, which parts need to come out, and just kind of troubleshooting as I go. And when I was struggling to figure out how much of this coolant housing needed to come off, I just started studying the bolt patterns on the new water pump and the gaskets that I was given. You can see me studying the gasket here, and that gave me a clue for exactly where all the bolts were and which ones needed to come off. So after concluding that the upper coolant housing was not connected to the water pump at all, I just tried to figure out how I could remove the thermostat housing from the upper coolant housing, and it was just 3 bolts. The gasket was a triangle shape, so there are the 3 vertical bolts here, here, and 1 back there, and I started working on those. Those are all 12mm. And now that the two are separated, I just need to work on that thermostat housing, and there's the gasket there. And I can tell I was getting tired at this point because I'm not showing you any of the right camera angles, but there is 1 horizontal bolt right here, and then there are 2 vertical bolts back behind the thermostat housing, and you'll be able to see those once I remove it, and again when I'm reinstalling it. Here's a quick freeze frame so you can see where that vertical bolt is located, and then after that I just went about cleaning up all of this coolant that spilled out, and it was just a little bit of residual coolant that was left in the water pump. And as tired as I was at this point, I wanted to make sure that I was doing it right, and it wouldn't feel right putting brand new parts on such a dirty engine. And it doesn't surprise me that it was so dirty back here because the gasket material around the timing cover was basically non-existent, so I just used some engine cleaner to get this back area nice and cleaned up. And right here is your crankshaft position sensor. Now would actually be a good time to replace that if you were doing this job, but I don't have the part and I don't want to wait for it, so I'm not going to. But I also wanted to show you where the timing mark was right here. You just need to line up this dent with this line here. And this is the time that you would want to replace the crankshaft seal for the front as well. And for some reason I don't have any footage of that, so I will be showing you that process when we get up to the camshaft seals. So now when you're reassembling, the spacer goes first, followed by this toothed disc, and that is what goes through your crankshaft position sensor. So now you can reinstall that, and that will be followed by the crankshaft sprocket. We will be rotating the engine manually when we're ready to set the timing marks, so we will reinstall the crank bolt now and just have it ready. Another piece of advice I got several times online was that I should not forget this small O-ring that sits back here. I guess it's notorious for wearing out and leaking, and it's really hard to get to, and the new kit does come with a new O-ring, so make sure you don't forget that. And before we reinstall the new water pump, I'm just going to check the fit and make sure that the gasket is correct and that the mating surface is nice and clean. And this is where it will get kind of tricky. I feel like I need one hand to hold the gasket in place while the other hand holds the new water pump while a third hand screws the bolts in. And another thing I did off camera was reconnect the thermostat housing to the new water pump with the new gasket. And here I go to bolt all of this up. I'm going to time lapse it for you so you don't have to watch me struggle for too long. The other part of this step I felt needed another hand was lining up that coolant pipe that we put the O-ring on in the back with the back of the water pump. That was really difficult to do while I was trying to bolt and hold everything else in place at the same time. And once you get all those bolts torqued down, you are done! But just with the water pump. But everything from here on out is basically just reassembly, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to check the torque on all of the bolts for every step that I do from here on out. And don't forget to reinstall that triangle gasket that goes between the thermostat housing and the upper coolant housing. My excitement about being almost done with this project encouraged me to get you guys some better camera angles. So right here you can see those 3 bolts that connect the 2 together. And some of you may be cringing that I am not putting a torque spec on anything outside of the instructions that I was given with the water pump kit. I just kind of follow my heart with the rest of the torque specs that are unknown to me. But torque specs are there for a reason, so remember, do as I say, not as I do, and look up the torque specs that you need for all of these. And these are those 2 vertical bolts that hold the back of the thermostat housing on, so I didn't give you a very good angle of those earlier, but now you can see where they go. And now back on top of the engine, I call this the quadruple hold everything together bracket. So go ahead and bolt that back up. And don't forget there is a ground loop isolator that sits here on top. That needs to be bolted in under this one. If you use the radio, this is what reduces the static. And you're probably asking yourself at this point, isn't he forgetting something? Because there's not even a timing belt on this vehicle yet, and I'm already buttoning up the top end of the engine. And you'd be right about that. And I am on the second night of this project, and I'm pretty sure at this point I am just avoiding setting the timing on this thing after everybody has told me the absolute frustration that setting the timing is. We'll get to it very soon. Here you can see how I like to number each one of my spark plug wires with the associated ignition coil so that I know where they go when I go to reconnect them. And here's that small bracket I was telling you about earlier that holds the wire for the crankshaft position sensor. Just carefully run it along the outside and that will just keep it protected from getting caught in anything. And here we are, timing belt time. Let's start with the easiest thing. This will be the idler pulley. It is just one bolt and one spacer, and it just goes in right here. Be sure to review the torque spec on your instructions. Next up is the idler pulley. This is the one with the offset bolt through the middle. Just go ahead and tighten that up, not too much because we're going to be moving it around a whole bunch as we set the timing. And then next we are going to take that new auto tensioner and get it bolted back up, and then we'll be ready to throw the timing belt on. And this step is optional, but both of my front camshaft seals are leaking, so I'm going to show you how to replace those. And you're going to start by removing the camshaft sprockets, being careful not to rotate the camshaft too much. These are the timing marks here. You want to line up the spline that has this white spot with this point right here. And this is something that people warned me about, but I had never experienced it myself. One of your camshafts is going to tend to want to jump like this, so in my attempts to hold it still while I was loosening it, it jumped and about broke my thumb off. But don't worry, the thumb did survive. But if this happens to you, just gently move the camshaft sprocket back into place, and you can kind of balance it there on the timing mark. It's just really important that you don't do any full rotations with the camshaft or the crankshaft. If it gets off a little bit, just rotate it back that same direction until you're lined up again. And you can see here that my cam seals are slightly recessed, and I think between that and the fact that they're 25 years old is what's contributing to the leaks. And they have a lot of different tools on the market specifically designed for removing these seals, but I find that a flathead screwdriver works just fine as long as you're careful not to gouge that camshaft or the housing around it. And once you have all the surfaces nice and clean, you can go ahead and lubricate your new seals with just some motor oil. There are lubricants out there that can eat through these seals, so just use motor oil and that'll work just fine. And then press it on lightly. And I just had a plastic block that's used for wood flooring laying around, and that's what I'm going to use to hammer this seal on. And I just started working it from different directions until the seal was nice and flush. And I wanted to make sure that it wasn't recessed like the other one. It was another tip that I was advised on. If you go past this housing surface, then you run the risk of leaking. And if you're worried about the sprocket turning while you're trying to torque this down, you can get a screwdriver or something long and try and brace it against something through these holes, and that will hold the sprocket in place while you tighten it down. And since I'm terrible about reading instructions, trying to get this timing belt on and tightened in the correct places was extremely difficult until I read the instructions, which say that you need to first loop the timing belt around the crankshaft here, and then you need to go around the driver's side cam sprocket, and then around the water pump, around the passenger side, and then you should be tight everywhere except right here and right here. Those are the only two places where you should have some slack. And then using these bent needle nose pliers, I was able to tighten the tensioner pulley. And while I have it tightened, I torque down the bolt. And you'll know when you have the right position on this tensioner pulley because this grenade pin on the auto tensioner will come out nice and easy. If it's too tight, then it's not ready to come out. And this is a process that I had to repeat probably a dozen times because I felt like I needed another hand to get it just right until I was able to get this position here. Someone online had sent me this photo of the position that tensioner pulley should be in relation to your timing marks. And once I was able to get that position, the pin on the auto tensioner slid right out. And here you can see all the timing marks lined up. And another step of the instructions that I did off screen was putting a socket on the crank bolt there and rotating the engine around a few times and then checking the tension and the torque after that to make sure that you're all good. Now, since everything from here on out is essentially reassembly and putting everything back together, I'm just going to let the video play while I answer a few questions. And the first one would be, if you're not familiar with these engines, you may be wondering why I'm focusing so much on the timing belt when the issue that I'm addressing is the water pump. Well, to explain this, we need to understand how the engine works. Camshafts are connected to valves that open and close to allow clean air in and exhaust air out. The crankshaft is connected to the pistons that compress the fuel and air mixture for combustion, and since this is an interference engine, that means that the valves and the pistons occupy the same area, just not at the same time. This helps create a larger range of movement and better compression, torque, and fuel economy, but on the downside, it can lead to major internal damage if the pistons ever hit the valves. The timing belt ensures that the valves are closed when the piston reaches top dead center, and that prevents any contact between the two. In the event that the timing belt does fail, the pistons will crash into the valve, causing catastrophic failure and requiring a rebuild of the engine. This is why so many of us Montero guys are paranoid about the state of our timing belts all the time. My rule of thumb is that it needs to be replaced at least every 100,000 miles. And that's another reason why I'm so glad I found this small access port so that I can check on the status of my timing belt more often. And the rest of this job is pretty straightforward. Once you have the timing covers bolted back up, the accessory plate can go on next with all those 14mm bolts. The torque spec would be 3 Ugga-Duggas on the impact, just for reference. And then after that, we will get the alternator back on. We cleaned up that alternator the best we could, hoping that we can get a little bit more life out of it. And then after that, it would just be replacing all of the accessory belts and pulleys, reinstalling the radiator hoses, and the transcooler hoses, filling the radiator with new coolant, burping any air out of the system, and finally reconnecting the battery. After that, do a quick bolt check on everything and you should be good to go. And that is how you can replace your water pump and timing belt in under 30 minutes. If only it were possible to actually do that. But thank you so much for watching this short video series. That was a quick 4 episodes on how to revamp your entire cooling system. In the next series, we're going to be working on our fuel system. The next symptoms that I've noticed are some lagging in the fuel delivery, and so I think we might have a clogged fuel filter. So we're going to be looking into that, checking out the injectors, the fuel lines, the fuel pump, and all of that. So join us for episode 6 and a new segment of the series.